Hi, class. My name is Alan, and my section focuses on children's understanding of biological processes versus psychological processes. So this is getting back to the theme of nature versus nurture that we've seen throughout the class. And they have this understanding that biological processes are independent of desires. So for example, on the other side, the book gives a great example of preschoolers. They can predict that if somebody, let's say, wants to lose weight, but they're eating a lot of unhealthy foods, then they're not going to get their wish. So just because they have the desire for something doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen, right? So the distinction between the two. Um, Living things versus inanimate objects. So they also understand that living things have these important biological functions that help to regulate their bodies and create that life. Whereas inanimate objects, they know that they do not have these same type of functions. And so an example that the book gives is the green color in a plant. So they know that the green of the plant serves a purpose to, a biological process for that plant to keep it alive. Whereas with a green emerald, an inanimate object, they understand that the green color does not serve that same type of function. With regards to inheritance, preschoolers young as 3 to 4 years old, they do understand that physical characteristics are inherited. So, hair color from their parents or eye color, for example. Example that the book gives is that they understand that, let's say, if a mouse gives birth and that young is hairless, they understand that once that animal does eventually grow hair, it's going to have the same color as its parents. So they can see that connection there. But as you get a little bit older, that starts to evolve a little bit. So a 5-year-old understands that heredity is, has more sway, you could say, over the environment. And so I was thinking of the example of Mowgli from the Jungle Book. So Mowgli, being a human, he is essentially adopted, raised by a Black Panther. And so a 5-year-old can understand that just because a human is adopted by this Black Panther, when the human grows up, it's not going to grow up into a Black Panther. It's going to grow up into an adult form of the same species. Now, I put this picture in the lower left of the different families there. So you can illustrate or it illustrates how characteristics are inherited through your family, right? So there's that connection there. But as you can see, each of the stages, right? The children, the parents, the grandparents, they're all different races here. And so they're not necessarily connected, and it's showing a bit more complexity because it is not a simple, it's not a simple concept, right? There's more to it. And so that leads directly into this concept of essentialism, or this essence that is believed that each living thing has inside of it. For example, with a dog, dogs having this essence of dogness that makes them a dog, that makes them bark and run and play and do everything that a dog does. Or similar with cats, right? Like a catness, an essence of that animal. And so the thing with essentialism is that it can lean a bit too far into the psychological aspects of the biological versus psychological. And so then this can create a conflict between with children when you're asking, like, okay, so how can humans and dogs and cats, how can they all have the same type of common ancestors, when essentialism is saying that each of those animals and those species has a unique essence to it. And so that can create some conflicts. Now, with regards to their understanding of growth, illness, and healing, children understand, preschoolers understand that living things do grow in size and complexity over time. They also understand that as they get older, they can get smaller. they can, as they lead to death eventually. So they do understand those relationships, as well as on the opposite side with inanimate objects, like a balloon example given in the book. A balloon can start off small, go to large, and then back to small. And so these same type of rules don't apply to inanimate objects, and preschoolers are able to distinguish between the two. Similarly with illness, preschoolers understand the concept of germs, and the idea that germs can cause illness, right? They can do bad things to them inside, even if they don't understand exactly how that's happening. They understand that it can. Whereas psychologically, just because they have this awareness of germs, it's not going to lead to a direct illness from those germs. And then lastly, with healing, the distinction between living things. So they know that if we get scratched, if a plant gets scratched, they know that we have the capacity to heal ourselves up to certain limits. Whereas with inanimate objects, they do not have the same type of functionality. So if a chair breaks, it's broken, it's not going to heal itself. So lastly, how do children acquire this biological knowledge? So there's two schools of thought, first of which is nativists, or the nature side of nature versus nurture. They believe that we are born with a biology module inside of us, this mechanism that helps to guide and inform us as we interact with the world after we're born. And so they believe that there are three characteristics which are reasons for why this is true. Firstly, that early in our human evolution, it was crucial to our survival to have knowledge of animals and plants, right? So which ones are dangerous, which ones are potentially food, which ones can heal and help us. So that being number one. Number two, this childlike wonder, this fascination with plants and animals, right? Children are far more gravitated towards living things than to inanimate objects. So because of that, that must be a reason for why we have a biology module. And then lastly, the similarity across children all over the world, in how they process and sort and organize information and structures is very similar across children of the world. So these structures would include, how they view growth, reproduction, inheritance, illness, healing. So they're all pretty similar across the board. And then you get lastly to the other side of the coin with empiricists, with the nurture side. So how do the children acquire biological knowledge? So in their environment, many different ways: personal observations, just children going about their day, observing the world, interacting with it, right? Learning, absorbing like a sponge. Then with their parents. So the book gives a great example of parents when they tell stories to children, and let's say there's a character, there's like an animal character, and as the animal goes through the story and has its adventures and troubles and triumphs, the children can pick up on the fact that the animal has intentions, that it does have goals, right? And that different members of the same species can have quite a lot in common, whereas inanimate objects, not so much. Teachers, if a teacher is talking about objects, a child is going to be much more likely to ask questions about the functionality of that object. Whereas on the other side, with animals and plants, a child would be far more likely to ask questions about the biological properties of those animals and plants, which could in turn lead to growth and a better, more fuller understanding, of the differences between the two. And then lastly, culture. So many different cultures, of course, across the world, each with their own idiosyncrasies. Book gives a great example of children in Japan. So preschoolers, 5-year-olds, their relationship to the world, to inanimate objects, because of Buddhism, they believe that objects have certain psychological properties about them, right? Pain, happiness, absorbing energy. And so that informs, how they interact with the world. And so really all of these different factors, the biological and psychological, nature versus nurture, nativist versus empiricist, it's not an either or. It's going to be a combination of all of these factors, interacting with one another in complex ways to inform the children of information and beliefs and values and how they interact with the world.